So welcome everybody, and welcome to this session, the Comprehension Blueprint, Designing and Delivering Informed Instruction. My name is Andra Bell, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kim Jenkins. We are excited to facilitate this session for everyone. A few housekeeping items before this session starts. This session is 75 minutes long and will be recorded. The chat feature will be off between participants, but you will be able to chat with us if you have any needs. Please keep your video feature off and mute yourself to eliminate any potential distractions to the presentation. Nancy will answer some questions at the end of this session if time. We would love for you to tweet out or share on social media all you are learning from the symposium. The hashtag for the Patent Literacy Symposium is hashtag PALit Symposium 2020. And now I'd like to introduce you to Nancy Hennessy. Nancy is an experienced teacher, diagnostician, administrator, and literacy consultant. While in public schools, she provided leadership in the development of innovative programming and curriculum development for special needs students, a statewide revision of special education code, and a state-of-the-art development program for all educators. She is a former national trainer for language essentials for teachers of reading and spelling, otherwise known as LETTERS. Nancy has delivered keynote addresses, virtual and in-person workshops, and training on topics that include professional development, strategic planning, proficient reading and writing, language, literacy connections, and dyslexia. Most recently, she developed a full-day training on dyslexia for North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. Nancy co-authored the second edition of Module 6 of LETTERS, Digging Teaching Taxonomy, and authored the chapter Working Word Meaning, Vocabulary Instruction, and Multisensory Teaching of Basic Skills. Her book, A Blueprint for Reading Comprehension, Helping Students Make Meaning, is set for publication in 2020. Nancy has held various positions for the International Dyslexia Association, including President and Branch Council Chair. She served on the National Joint Committee for Learning Disabilities and is an honorary member of the Delta Kappa Gamma Society. Nancy is the 2011 recipient of IDA's Margaret Ralston Lifetime Achievement Award and received IDA's 2012 June Award. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Andra. And thank you, Kim. I'm very appreciative of your support and facilitation today. I also want to thank Patton, including Pam Kastner and all of her colleagues who have worked so hard on providing this really marvelous professional development opportunity for so many of you. I also would like to make mention of the fact that what I'm going to be sharing with you is the result of my learning over several years. I'm particularly indebted to Louisa Moats. I know many of us are. A number of years ago, Louisa invited me to become a LETTERS trainer, a national LETTERS trainer. And that set me on a journey of learning far more about comprehension than one could imagine. And in fact, when I co-authored with her the second edition module, we actually included a framework for comprehension instruction, the first iteration of really the blueprint that I'm going to be discussing with you today. So she's truly been my mentor and my inspiration, as have a number of the other researchers that you'll see quoted or cited on the slides today. Last but not least, thanks to all of you for being willing to continue to think about these important topics related to literacy as they pertain particularly to the success of your students. So we're going to talk about the comprehension blueprint, and we're going to be talking about designing and delivering informed instruction today. All right, let's see if we can get ourselves moving. You have some support materials that we'll be referencing from time to time. You have a copy of most of the PowerPoint slides. That's your first handout. And your second handout is a participant guide. Hopefully we'll be able to keep you engaged and you'll feel a part of this. I wish I were in the room with you, but given circumstances, thank you for being here, and we will make the best of this, I'm sure. Here's today's purpose. I want to talk a bit about the complexity of comprehension and the role of language processes and skills. You'll hear me talk a lot about processes today. I want to introduce a blueprint, in fact, that's based on those necessary language processes and skills, an evidence-based framework for instruction. I want to connect, just briefly, because it's a snapshot today, I want to connect the blueprint to evidence-informed instructional strategies and activities. And hopefully, all of this will inform your approach to comprehension instruction. Now, you may have noticed the elephant up in the right-hand corner, and while I'm not all that fond of this saying, it's apropos today. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. This will be a great deal of information. And so as you think about yourself, your students, your practice, your roles and responsibilities, one bite at a time. Why are we here? All right, we're here for students. We're here so that all students, including those that struggle, have this opportunity to acquire and be capable of using essential language and cognitive skills that are necessary for making meaning of text. Whether our students are reading by eye or ear, we have to keep in mind that comprehension is incredibly complex, and it demands an informed instructional approach. I thought it might be helpful, as we had this conversation, to bring a student into our discussion, or students actually, and have you think a little bit about your students. And when you ask them to perform different tasks, or you ask them to demonstrate understanding, what are the processes, what are the skills that they need in order to deal with texts that are age and grade appropriate, texts that contain academic language, right? For instance, Antonio listening to The Velveteen Rabbit, and we ask him, what do you think this means when a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real. We're not talking about shallow comprehension here. We're going deep. Or Jermaine in 3rd grade, who's working on a unit that has everything to do with activism and revolutionaries. Dear Benjamin Banneker, the National Geographic readers, Rosa Parks. Was Benjamin an activist? Why or why not? Who is Rosa Parks? Is she a revolutionary? Why or why not? And then we have an example of a 4th grader reading Dinotopia and the Mystery of the Tattooed Mummy. So questions that have to do with dinosaurs and archaeologist discoveries. And then in 5th grade, Matt reading The One and Only Ivan, or maybe Tuck Everlasting that I'll note today. What lessons does this book teach us about the treatment of animals? And in Tuck Everlasting, would you want to be immortal? Why or why not? So you see, these are bigger ideas that we want our students to be able to work with as they read texts. Will in 6th grade, The Founding of an American Democracy, an excerpt from Common Lit. Why did the Founding Fathers have to compromise? And then Lily going into 9th grade, reading Stalin, A Brutal Legacy from Common Lit, or Animal Farm, and thinking about dictatorship and power, and in what ways might a fable, for instance, serve as a condemnation of Soviet communism. So thinking about when we ask our students to demonstrate understanding, to show that they have a deep comprehension, what are the processes and skills that they will need, right, in order to be able to succeed. Now that means that we have to have a strong foundation, right? So let's talk for a few moments about our knowledge of reading comprehension, because as we move forward, as we think about informing our practice, we always have to be thinking about what do we know about this and why are we proceeding in a certain fashion. So you have in your participant guide, which you can use throughout, a statement that says reading comprehension is. And I would just invite you, I'll just pause for just a couple of seconds, but I would just invite you to script maybe 3 or 4 words, what comes to mind when you think about reading comprehension. And at the end of this part of the discussion, we'll come back and you can add some thoughts to this. So I'll stop for about 10 seconds, not very much time, but see what you can do with that. All right, let's see if you captured any of the thoughts that are represented in this statement, or this description, I should say, of reading comprehension. This comes from some recent work of Castles and colleagues. So reading comprehension is not a single entity. That's incredibly important for us to keep in mind as we have this conversation about informed instruction. It can't be explained by a unified cognitive model. It's the orchestrated product, and in fact, what we ask our students to do is to produce products. But they can't do that unless they have in place the linguistic and cognitive processes that are necessary for them to interact with text. And as they interact with text, they bring forward their background knowledge, they work with the features of text, and they have set purposes and goals in mind. So some of you may be thinking, as I'm talking about this, about the Rand Reading Study Group report, which emphasizes the fact that there are dimensions that affect comprehension: what the reader brings, how the text presents, the demands of the text, what the task actually is that connects to purpose, and then the context, right? And the context can be broad, but for me, the context is all of you, those of you who are creating that educational setting for your students. Again, process matters, right? You can't have quality product without quality processes. And of course, that brings to mind, what are the processes we're talking about here? Well, we all know the reading rope, I think. Hollis Scarborough gave us a gift, right? She told us that in order to achieve proficient reading, we have to do what? Both be able to read the words and make meaning simultaneously. How do we make meaning? By using language and cognitive processes and skills. How does she define those, right? She talks to us about the need for background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, which include, right, semantics and syntax, for me, translates sentence comprehension. Verbal reasoning includes inference, and literacy and print knowledge includes print concepts and text structure knowledge. These work interactively with one another, independently, but interactively as well. And that's important for us to think about, kind of this idea of this orchestrated product is the result of a set of, right? These processes are working together so that ultimately the reader, when the reader comes to text, they're able to create for themselves a coherent representation of text. Now, in the upper right-hand corner, what you see is a representation of the cognitive processes that are necessary, and they really create or work in concert with these linguistic or language processes. So let me just review those quickly, and then I'll explain the graphic to you. So Judith Irwin has provided this, and she talks to us about the fact that our students work with microprocesses. They have to work with the idea units that are expressed by the words and the phrases and the clauses within the sentences, all right? And they have to integrate the meanings within and between the sentences. And they have to monitor, be metacognitive about what it is that they're reading and make decisions as to whether or not they are actually getting meaning from the text, achieving their purpose. And they need to integrate their background knowledge, right? So that they can move beyond the micro level of the text to create what are called macro processes or deeper understanding of the text, right? Walking away with kind of this overall representation of meaning. Now, in terms of thinking of this as the interaction between the reader and the text, we have a reader in the upper right-hand corner. Well, she's actually in the lower left-hand corner, excuse me. And we have her books in the lower right-hand corner. She's interacting with the text by using those language and processes and skills, those cognitive processes, to make sense of what it is that she's reading about dinosaurs, actually. Right, she has to deal with the words, vocabulary, academic vocabulary found in academic texts. She has to deal with the sentences, right? Sentences have many ideas within one sometimes: density, length, different structures, simple, compound, complex. And those sentences are tied up through the use of something called cohesive devices, ties, and connectives. She has to integrate her background knowledge. That includes her schema or her specific knowledge of a topic. By the way, text structure is included here because it's a specialized type of background knowledge. And she can use her background knowledge, her schema, to make inference. Overall, working at the surface level with the words and the syntax, the sentences, right, in combination with what the author implied, the text base, integrating that background knowledge and creating this mental model or overall representation of text. This is not easy. This is not simple. This can't be explained. just in one way. This is complex. And so comprehension itself calls for complex solutions related to how we design and deliver instruction. We have to consider all of these different factors, all of these different components as we think about our instruction. By the way, kind of interesting to think about this, Spencer, Quinn, and Wagner in 2014 actually talked about the fact that calling reading comprehension problems might be a misnomer. In fact, these are more language comprehension problems. And others in the field, including individuals like you, Katz, have done a great deal of work in this area. For instance, studies that have to do with, what predicts future comprehension problems, and it always comes back to language. All right, so quick check now. I gave you just a few seconds, actually, to jot down some thoughts about reading comprehension. At the beginning of this section, I'm going to give you just a few seconds again to jot down anything that you might want to add to your thinking about what reading comprehension is. So 10 seconds. All right, so that was the first part of our talk together today. Thinking about this complexity of reading comprehension, thinking about what are these processes and skills that are necessary in order for the student to construct meaning. So now we're going to talk about the blueprint and a little bit more probably. All right. If you're going to construct comprehension, if you're going to construct a reading comprehension house, all right, then we have to be thinking about a blueprint for doing that, right? A way of doing that, right? And in this case, the blueprint identifies for us what the structural elements are of the house, right? What is foundational to constructing comprehension? Critical understandings, big ideas. What do we want our students to take away? Comprehension monitoring, this ability to think about whether or not what you're reading actually makes sense. Are you accomplishing your goals? Right? And then these different support beams or pillars that represent actually the strands of the reading rope, but translated into instructional components. So we have to teach directly and indirectly. Vocabulary, the meaning of words, background knowledge, text structures, sentence comprehension, and then teach our students how to answer questions at different levels of understanding, including inference. And then, of course, we want to put a roof on the house, all right, reading comprehension. So we're going to delve now into the blueprint itself, all right, but I wanted to at least make that connection back and tell you that the blueprint is evidence-based. It's based on the work of Hollis Scarborough. It's based on the work of Kate Kane, who talks about levels of language processing that are necessary for comprehension, as well as the work of others. So here's the blueprint, right? And I don't know why this drawing on here, because I'm not doing any drawing, so that's kind of interesting. But let's take a look at the blueprint and let's have some conversation about it. Now, let me say this to you, that the blueprint is a master plan. This is not a lesson plan that you're looking at. This is not a lesson organizer, all right? This is intended to organize and scaffold your instruction, right? You don't accomplish this in one day, all right? But organize and scaffold your instruction of a particular text, right? It calls for evidence-based strategies and activities, and they certainly will align with each one of the components that are represented on the left. It allows for flexibility dependent upon the text that you're working with, your students and the context, and it acknowledges the metacognitive nature of teaching. So in looking at the blueprint, it's divided, first of all, on the left-hand side into those components that you need to consider and that align with what we know is necessary in order for students to make meaning. On the right-hand side, all right, what you find are a series of questions that help you probe actually the design of instruction. And they're questions that reflect what we have learned from the research about effective approaches, methodology in each of these particular areas for each of these components. So very briefly, I want you to take a look at preparing for instruction, and we will touch upon today critical understandings of text and purpose for reading text. When we get ready, we have to think that through, all right, before we actually work with the text. And then as we work with the text, we need to be considering what strategies, activities will we be using, see the bidirectional arrow, before, during, and after instruction. We also have to be thinking about how we can get our students to monitor their comprehension at those different levels of language. The text reading components, again, represent the reading rope, but translated into instruction, vocabulary, language structures, phrases, clauses, sentence comprehension, knowledge, text structure. Remember I said that's a specialized type of knowledge, background knowledge, and then levels of understanding that include inference, and then expression of understanding. How will we go about asking our students to express their understanding of comprehension? All right, we'll take just a few of these and delve into a few of these, but note that all of these should be considered as you're preparing text. Focus on those that are most necessary, dependent upon your students and the text themselves. So this just briefly describes then for you what the blueprint in fact is, and I've just mentioned a few of these things. It's evidence-based, it's a master plan, not a lesson plan, not a unit organizer. Hopefully I'll have enough time to share some samples of those with you. It should be organizing and scaffolding your teacher preparation. It's calling for those evidence-based strategies and activities. I'll share a few today, all right? But I can't share everything that we know, but I will give you the basis for this, right? And again, flexibility and the metacognitive nature of teaching, okay? So let's start with preparing for using the blueprint. And let's talk a little bit about the fact that one of the things that we want to do here in preparing for using the blueprint is we want to think about what knowledge base do we want our students to walk away with? What are the critical understandings, whether we're reading one text or multiple texts on a particular topic or theme, right? Because comprehension is really about learning. So while we're talking about the development of language processes and skills, those literacy skills, let's not forget about the fact that the reason that we read is to learn. We also need to be thinking about those readings that will support the development of the knowledge base that we want our students to have, as well as academic language. So you're going to hear me say this over and over again: grade and age appropriate texts, texts that are academic in nature, beginning with little ones, all right? So again, here's our blueprint, and we know where we're focused. So what are we talking about with critical understandings? Well, we're talking about those big ideas, the important understandings that we want our students to get inside of and retain after they've gotten many of the details. So if I'm putting together, and I'll share with you an example of doing this, but if I'm putting together a number of different texts to study over the course of, let's say, a month with my students, if I have that option, whether I'm reading aloud or whether they're reading with me or independently, then I want to identify, what's the big ideas that I want them to walk away with, right? Why do I have them reading? What's the knowledge base I'm trying to build? Reading lessons need to have, this is Shanahan, double outcomes: an improvement to reading ability, right? And an increased knowledge about whatever was read. So yes, let's develop literacy skills. Let's develop these processes and skills, but also let's be certain that, we're learning about something as we're reading. This is an example that was created by a very talented colleague. All right, it happens to be an example for 5th grade. Now I realize for some of you, you're reading individual texts or your curriculum is dictating your texts, right? Or perhaps you have the freedom to identify additional text, or maybe you're even involved in curriculum development. So here's an example of, if we were thinking about this from the perspective of big ideas, critical topics, right? Enduring understandings, this might be a 5th grade across time that we could use. So thinking about the fact that I'm sorry, represents all grade levels, but the last column is the 5th grade. So you might think about enduring understandings for little ones. Stories can teach us important lessons, right? Moving through the grades, authors and poets use language to convey the beauty of the world around us. Reading expands our understanding of the world. Moving on, a combination of people, events, and causes led to the American Revolution, America's independence. People can communicate through words. And then animals have stories to tell too, messages to communicate. They can contribute to our understanding of lives. And then last but not least, kind of this idea of coming of age, and change is inevitable, and change can be both positive and negative. Now you'll note that there are topics across the top, then these enduring understandings, and then some essential questions that we can be asking our students and including for ourselves. The whole idea here to be very purposeful about focusing on learning for our students, this acquisition of knowledge. Now, what goes along with that is we certainly want to be including varied readings, narrative, informational readings for our students that reflect the knowledge base, critical understandings, right? So be thinking about, even if you already have books in place, what are the critical understandings you want your students to be taking away, that mental model, that overall understanding? Will the readings provide opportunities to develop language processes and skills? Vocabulary, background knowledge, sentence comprehension, levels of understanding, text structure, right? Are they focused on the development of academic language? Even from the time little ones come to text, they have to be acquiring the language of school, the language of books, the language of the standards. We initially read to them, and then ultimately we hope that they're reading, or we're providing access. And do our readings that we ask our students to engage in represent different genre, disciplines, and integrated approach, right? So just a couple of words from individuals that we certainly know the work of. Marilyn Adams: giving children easier text when they're weaker readers serves to deny them the very language and information they need to catch up on and move on. And then Shanahan: what struggling readers or students need is guidance from a teacher on how to make sense of the text designed for kids at their respective grade levels. The kinds of texts those kids may otherwise see only on standardized tests when they have to grapple with them on their own. Right? And then examples to go with. Again, I'm sorry, I focused initially on it just being 5th grade, but across the top of those critical understandings, enduring understandings, that 5th grade column, right? Thinking about coming of age, right? And here are some of the books that that particular individual, same talented teacher, chose, right, to use in a unit, a themed unit, right, in order to convey message and build understanding. Mighty Miss Malone, What Was the Great Depression, Esperanza Rising, Out of the Dust, and so on. Right. And just so we have an understanding of, when I say we want to develop academic language, I want everyone thinking about the fact that academic language within text means that we use precise vocabulary, oftentimes vocabulary based in Latin roots or Greek forms, right? That our sentence structures, our syntactic structures are more complex, right? And of course, we could also talk about varied discourse structures and so on. So from that list of books, here's 2 different books: The Children of the Great Depression, Esperanza Rising. Just take a moment and look at the language that we see. Think a little bit about the sentence construction that you actually see. For instance, when I look at the selection from Esperanza Rising, that's one sentence. Talk about density, right? But this is what our children have to encounter as they move through the grades, and we need to be developing their ability to do so, to work with these texts. So quickly then, as we finish talking about preparing the text, all right, I want you to ask yourself, and we can rephrase this just a little bit, okay? Do the readings that you use develop identified critical understandings, right? Are you making that connection to your readings, right? And I'm not talking about decodable text or predictable text. They have different purposes. Will these readings, or will your readings, provide opportunities to develop language processes and skills? Think about the blueprint. Think about the reading rope. Do they provide opportunities to develop academic language, right? Precise words, advanced vocabulary, advanced syntactic structures, varied discourse structures. Do they represent different genre, disciplines? And have you considered access issues for your struggling readers? If you have older students still struggling with word recognition, they have to have access by ear. We cannot deny them this ability to continue to grow those language processes. Right, and last but not least, as we think about this, I want to be certain that I emphasize as we move into the blueprint that your instruction needs to be explicit. I will talk about some indirect or what I call intentional on incidental on purpose instruction. We have intentional on purpose, explicit. We have incidental on purpose. But for the most part, your role is to provide explicit instruction. Structured, systematic, and scaffolded, as Anita Archer would say. Your decision as to where you provide the instruction that's targeted at the varied aspects of the blueprint before, during, and after instruction. That's your decision. And of course, we work in whole group initially, then small group and individual. So we have to think about really being knowledgeable about what goes into the reading of text and then being able to target where we might have to intensify instruction. All right. So that's the first section. And now what we're going to do is take a look at actual text reading and some of these components that are making up the very structure of the comprehension house. And we'll begin with vocabulary because this is such an important aspect of literacy, such an important contributor to meaning. So here under vocabulary, here are the questions I want you to think about. Which words will your students need to know? Which words are worth knowing? Which ones will you intentionally target and directly teach? Which ones will you incidentally on purpose teach, and how and when? Which words will you purposefully discuss, incorporate into expressive language activities? How and when will you teach and foster the use of independent word learning strategies? Those questions directly align with what we know is an informed approach to vocabulary instruction. Now we'll start by thinking about what we think vocabulary is, all right? And I happen to like this definition or this description, Marilyn Adams. So take a moment and read through. So what's critical here is they're not just words themselves. They convey understanding, right? So this interface between communication and thought. And so authors choose their words very, very carefully, as we do when we're writing something, or even now as I'm speaking. If we were to define vocabulary, we could define it as a mental dictionary, as the lexicon, all of the words that we recognize and know deeply, or we could say the words that we use expressively and receptively. And of course, when we're using words receptively, all right, or word meanings, means we're reading, right? And what are we doing? We're trying to take meaning from, we're receiving, right? Same thing with listening. And when we're being expressive, we're expressing our thoughts using words, writing, and speaking. Successful comprehension depends upon accessible, well-specified, and flexible knowledge of word forms and meaning, Chuck Perthetti's work. And he clearly tells us that when we store words in meaning networks, that we store their phonological, their orthographic, the syntactic, and their semantic meaning, or their meanings, the semantic networks, right? So others tell us that up to 90 to 95% of the words in text need to be understood for us to make meaning of the text. So what are we to do then as teachers? Well, this is the informed instructional framework that I use for vocabulary. Now, these are not my ideas per se, they're my interpretation of my reading of the literature as well as my work with so many of you. What are the pillars, right? What aligns with those questions that I just asked you? The pillars of these for vocabulary instruction. We need to intentionally teach. We need to incidentally on purpose plan oral experiences. We need to intentionally teach independent word learning strategies. And running below, we need to keep our students interested and excited, word consciousness about words. Now, time does not allow for me to delve into all of this, but I'm going to focus on this first column because this is the one that we're most engaged with in classrooms. Intentional, explicit teaching of words. And so when we have to intentionally teach words, right, how do we decide on which words? Now, sometimes they're decided for us, and if they are, then we need to understand and know criteria that allow for us to see whether or not those were the best decisions for our students. But word choice, then we have to know what the principles of instruction are. What does effective instruction actually look like? What should guide our instruction? And therefore, what should the routines look like? Can we derive the routines from those instructional principles? And what do we need to do in terms of processing and practice? Because this first column has everything to do with developing depth of knowledge. We recognize many words, but how many do we really own? That's depth of knowledge. And when we deeply know word meanings, we know a lot about the words, and we can easily access them for multiple purposes, both receptively and expressively. So let's just talk a little bit about choosing words, right? So what might we consider when we think about choosing words? Well, we probably want to think about those words we're going to directly teach, but I like to save some time. So I also know that I'm going to have to provide some incidental instruction, right, on purpose. And one way I can do that when I'm reading is point of contact teaching. In other words, as we're reading, if I'm reading to the student, or if the student has a question, or beforehand, I can just provide a synonym or substitution for the word right within the text. All right, intentional word learning strategies. I want to think about, are there words within the text that would give me opportunity for my students to practice using context clues? Of course, I've taught them what the context clues are and how to use them. Same thing with morphology. Are there some words that will allow for my students to make use of their knowledge of base words and root words and prefixes and suffixes to infer meaning? And by the way, when you use context, you infer meaning as well. Okay, choice in this first column, all right, based on the book, Tuck Everlasting, which by the way, I happen to have right here. Okay, all right. A book that I mentioned earlier, maybe a 4th or 5th grade book. All right, I'm going to base my choice of those words that you see in the first column on these criteria: usefulness and importance, understanding, and growth, right? So basically usefulness, am I going to see this word over and over again? Will it occur across other text disciplines and so on? Is it important to the understanding of the text, right? Is it essential that I know this word? And is there some possibility for growth? What would a semantic network look like, or a morphology map for this particular word, right? Now you may use other criteria that might have sounded very similar to Beck's criteria, for instance. There are different ways to approach this, but we do need to be thinking about how do we make good decisions about the words we're going to teach, because we can't teach that many, all right? What about the routine? Well, I said to you the routine should derive from principles of instruction. So here's what I know. Work of Stephen Stahl. That I have to give my kiddos definitional and contextual information, right? So I'm going to think about that in terms of a routine. A more complex routine, once I introduce words, I have to be thinking about how do I give them multiple exposures and engagement in deep processing and varied activities for before, during, and after reading. How do I do all of that? Because this is what works. These are principles for effective instruction. All right. Well, I can embed these ideas into routines. For instance, here's a simple routine. I know it doesn't look quite so simple, but it really is. All right. Let's just look at the first 2 columns. Okay. This simple vocabulary routine needs to incorporate what? Both definitional and contextual information. So one of the things I'm going to have to think about is the design of, all right, a student-friendly definition, and then I'm going to have to go to my text, the contextual information. So you see in the first column, here's what the teacher needs to do. In the second column, the expectation from the student. By the way, I added the third column because I want for us to be thinking about the fact that I said a little while ago something about well-formed representations. That when, in fact, we store words, we store multiple dimensions of the word, the phonology, the morphology, the syntax, the semantics, the meaning. So this routine accommodates for that. So I guess it's not all that simple, but it's simple in comparison to everything else that perhaps we have to do. So what do? We pronounce the targeted word, the word immortal from Tuck Everlasting. And I'm just pronouncing it, and I'm asking my students to listen, and I'm asking them to echo, and I'm going to ask them some questions. Haven't seen the word yet. The phonology, all right, and the morphology of the word. What might I ask them? How many syllables? Hear any morphemes? What part of speech do you think it might be? Right? And then I'm going to explain it in everyday language. What does immortal mean? Well, it's a characteristic. What kind of a characteristic? Well, it's a little bit different. It means you never die, right? That you go on and on and on. Okay. And then you can do some examples from context, and I can go to my book and I can find the use of immortal, or I can even find descriptions. Right? If you know the book, there's a spring. If you drink from the spring, the water of the spring, you become immortal. That water, it stops you right where you are. If you had a drink of it today, you'd stay a little girl forever. You'd never grow up, not ever. You see, when I told you I'm 104 years old, I was telling the truth, but I'm really only 17. And so far as I know, I'll stay 17 till the end of the world. So you can give examples, all right, but you can also find within the book an actual sentence that uses the word immortal. And then you can ask students for examples, and then you can say, spell, and write the word. Simple routine, all right? But what about the rest of the routine? What do these principles of instruction tell us? Well, they tell us we need to process and practice. And so I've represented that in 3 categories. We can help our students make semantic connections because words are stored in networks. We have semantic networks of words. So by drawing semantic maps, by using semantic feature analysis, by using concept maps. We can help our students process and practice through the use of representations. And I know many of you have your students draw pictures, or find pictures, or make videos, or through gestures and movement that directly connect to and represent the word meaning, or word walls, where we put up interesting, intriguing words. Maybe we categorize them even by parts of speech. And then use, right? Giving students opportunity to express understanding through questions or examples or conversation prompts or writing stems, but all connected back to the book, all connected back to the text. All of these activities, all of these strategies I'm sharing, always go back to using the text as the base. So this is an overall roadmap before I move on, and I do need to move on. This is an overall roadmap that has samplings of all different kinds of activities and strategies under word choice. You might not use the criteria I use. There's some others. How to come up with a definition. And then here's some examples for the connections, for the representations, and for the use. And again, you might want to add some things to this. This may represent some things that you're using. I simply wanted to give you a sampling. All right. So now we've talked about vocabulary, right? And I think what we now need to do is move on. All right, I'm going to go past this for now. Let's move on to language structures to sentence comprehension. And this is an area that I think is not well represented in our instruction. And yet it's very important because when you think about the way that we build meaning, all right, it's kind of this aggregation of successive units of meaning. And so we think about the word meaning, we think about the syntactic structure of the sentence. This is what Kate Kane tells us. And then we look to integrate the meaning within and between sentences, then integrate our background knowledge so we understand what's not stated explicitly, but what's implied, right? Well, sentence structure is key to understanding, grammar is key to understanding how words actually are conveyed. So let's take a look at the blueprint, all right? So are there phrases, clauses, sentence structures that may be difficult for your students? How and when will you directly teach sentence comprehension? How and when will you teach students to work with challenging sentences? How will you facilitate the integration of ideas within and between sentences, the use of cohesive ties and connectives? How and when will you teach your students to work with these? Well, I certainly can't answer all of those questions, but let me briefly give you a few answers. Remember the elephant, one bite at a time. Okay, so this is a poll. Let's see if we can put our poll up. True or false? Syntax is a vehicle for conveying meaning.
Sorry, Nancy, working on that.
Okay.
Kim, I think you have to put up the poll since you're logged into this account and I'm in my own.
I can see the poll,
Okay.
but I don't know if our participants can.
Okay.
I'm hoping they can.
Just reached 51%, 52.
All right, let's stop the poll here. All right. I am so proud of all of you. Yeah, 98% of you said this is true. All right. There must be a lot of letters folks on this call, as well as people who read the research. So yeah. Oh my goodness. This is supposed to click on here and do something, but it doesn't want to do it. Oh my. Let's see. Let me try it over here. There we go. All right. So true is correct. And of course, false is incorrect. So yes, syntax is a vehicle for conveying meaning. So if you're grammophobic, I'm sorry, but the reality here is that we really need to understand this particular language system. Syntax lives within the sentence. It's uniquely positioned between the individual words in the text. That's Nancy Eberhardt. Cheryl Scott has said the sentences are the worker bees of the text, okay? Just a couple of other thoughts. Sentence comprehension means you have to extract these interconnected sets of propositions, ideas, and that's dependent on semantics and syntax, right? And then that words contribute to the meaning of the propositions while syntax provides the structure. So when I said you need to understand phrases and clauses, even parts of speech, you need to understand their function. You need to understand how they convey meaning, all right? I'm not so much about giving them all names and labeling them, but understand how they work within sentences. Here's the other thing that is important to understand, that when you are working within academic text, sentences can be real problems. They can be challenges, obstacles to understanding. Why? Because when you look at academic text, and I'm talking about age and grade appropriate text, even nursery rhymes, right? You're going to find very long sentences. You're going to find sentences that have more than one idea within a sentence. That's the density. You're going to find embeddings, in other words, like relative clauses that kind of interrupt the flow between the who and the do, right? You're going to find dependencies. Think about complex sentences, compound complex sentences, and sometimes order, active versus passive. So all of these constructions can be found within academic text, and our students have to, first of all, understand basics about how sentences contribute to meaning, and then we can move to work with them in terms of some of these other obstacles that present. And I just wanted to give you a couple of examples. So the Velveteen Rabbit, all right? Take a look at the second sentence. Look at the length of the second sentence. How do we help our students work their way through that? We have to work with them in terms of identifying the who, the do, the which one, what kind, how many, how, when, where, and so on. Second example, the founding of an American democracy. I think you saw that as a 6th or 7th grade example, all right, early on. Same thing, that's one sentence, right? And so again, we have to be thinking about teaching our students basics, moving from basics to working with more complex sentences. Now, this can be done intentionally and it can be done incidentally. This is just some thinking. This is another roadmap in a sense, or a framework. for the teacher, the sentence attuned teacher. So you can be thinking about grammar-based deconstruction activities. Yes, I use the word grammar. Sentence-based activities, cohesive device activities. I just talked about those in my inference workshop because there's an overlap here. Or incidentally, how we can early on through reading experiences, shared reading, group and independent reading, the fluency connection, oral language experiences, teacher-student talk, how we can incidentally develop. I'm just going to show you one example because that's all we really have time for, but I want you to keep in mind there are multiple things we can be doing, and we can connect our writing instruction to our reading comprehension instruction. So this is an activity, and all of these words have been taken from the founding of an American democracy, right? And of course, there's some prerequisite knowledge here in terms of understanding that parts of speech, different parts of speech, answer different questions. So who or what questions are answered by nouns or pronouns? Is or what is or were or was doing are answered by verbs. Which one, what kind, how many? By adjectives. When, where, and how by adverbs, right? And so if I take some of the words from that particular selection, I put them on word cards, right? And I have my students, maybe even during a warm-up activity, begin to work with these words so that they understand the kinds of questions that they answer and do a sort with them. They also can serve as a basis for making a prediction about what they're going to read, right? But the important piece here, understanding the function of each of these words. And some of them, for instance, compromises belong in both categories. And that gives us an opportunity to have some conversation as well. So there are multiple kinds of activities that we can build in for sentence comprehension. But what we have to keep in mind here is that this can be where the breakdown occurs for our students. Right? They need to know the meaning of the words. They have to work out the syntactic structure of the sentences. Now, I didn't share with you for vocabulary and informal assessment, so I will share this one here with you because I want to point out to you that for each one of these components of the blueprint, you know, when I begin to think about assessment, comprehension assessment is pretty complex. Our standardized assessments really, they give us some general information, but they don't give us very specific information about what our students can and can't do. We have some inventories that are helpful as well, qualitative reading inventory, but I really want to zero in and be able to differentiate from my students as well. So I think using many of the activities that we're using to process and practice after we directly teach, these activities give us opportunity to do some informal assessment. So this is building blocks of sentences, and I would have taught my students about parts of speech, what their function is. I would have taught them about the differences between phrases and clauses and how they contribute to meaning, right? And so I'd be able to ask them, parts of speech are words that do what, right? A phrase is, a clause is. Who can find the word that answers the question? Who can find a phrase that answers the question? Who can find a clause that answers the question? And even some diagramming, yes, but let's find the who and the do, or the which, one, where, how, why, and so on. Okay, visual representations. All right, so we come to knowledge, and this will be the last part of the blueprint that we'll talk about. And again, I'm coming back to my comprehension house here, and beautifully done by a young man for me. And let's talk a little bit about background knowledge. And wow, has this gotten a lot of press in the last year or two? And rightfully so. For a number of years, many individuals have been talking about the fact that we've neglected knowledge. And I want to remind you that I think it's critically important that we have a knowledge goal as well as a literacy goal when we design comprehension instruction. All right, so here's the questions that I have. The first set of questions to the right here have to do with text structure, which I'm not talking about today, right? The second set, what background knowledge is critical to understanding the text? How and when will you teach students to access and build their knowledge and integrate it with the text, right? So just a few words about this. Marilyn Adams again. Knowledge is the medium of understanding and therefore of reading with understanding. So this equating knowledge and comprehension. A number of researchers have done that as well, including people like Don Compton, right? Prior knowledge about the topic at hand is like mental Velcro. Yep, Velcro strips up. The relevant knowledge gives the words of the text places to stick and make sense, thereby supporting comprehension and propelling the reading process forward. You cannot reach deeper levels of understanding without background knowledge. I said this earlier in a workshop, you know, inference doesn't happen without background knowledge, all right? Actually, all text reading requires different types of background knowledge, okay? So where's the research? This is actually Don Compton's work. Number of studies have reported that individual differences in background knowledge significantly influence the building of a representative situation or mental model. That's the overall understanding of the text. That's the ultimate goal of comprehension. It's what you take away with you. It's not all of the fine details, all right? It's the kind of these big ideas, the enduring understandings, right? The importance of the coherent mental representation, and then the fact that readers who possess high levels of knowledge consistently exhibit better comprehension and retention than readers with low levels of knowledge. Well, that makes quite a bit of sense, doesn't it? So here's another poll. Oh, and I guess it already did the agree or disagree for you. I didn't know the little thumbs up was going to pop up right away. So here was my question, all right? So Andrea and Kim, we can hold on to that poll. We don't need to do it. Whether or not readers understand a text depends far more on how much background knowledge and vocabulary they have relating to the topic than on how much they've practiced comprehension skills. And I would add the word strategies. Okay, so pretty important. So what do we do about this, all right? Well, so just some general advice. This is general advice. Focus on knowledge. What kids read matters. I think I've made that point, all right? And tying your text to whatever your understandings or your ideas are that you want your students to walk away with. They should learn what they read. So reading is not just about answering those questions, but taking knowledge with them, right? And they should review and revisit content. And so sometimes we talk about spiral curriculum, for instance. When I think about this, I think about, for instance, you know, if your unit is focused, and we talked about this early on with that chart of critical understandings on revolutionaries and activists, for instance, in 3rd or 4th grade, well, you certainly can review that in 6th, 7th, or 8th grade, right, with higher level readings. All right. So what's the tool that you need? So I call this the ABCs instructional tool. A, activate and assess. B, build. C, connect, all right? So I want you to just take a moment. All right, I think we have enough time for this. Just take a moment and think a little bit. I think this is in your participation guide as well. What would you put in each one of these blocks? Could you think of one thing for each? How do you activate and assess? How do you build? And then how do you connect? Just take a moment and think about that and just script something quickly or just have it in mind. All right, hopefully everybody has something in mind. And let me show you what I thought of. Now, again, not the be all and the end all, but based on what I know about this topic and what others have taught me, all right? So we can activate and assess through the use of anticipation guides. I'll show you an example in a moment. Questions and prompts, charts, webs, maps, or visual images, pictures. Pictures are wonderful to do this. We can build through multiple topical themed texts. I think I've been talking a bit about that. Virtual and real-time experiences, authentic artifacts. I'll share something in a moment. And vocabulary connections. We know that vocabulary is very reflective of our background knowledge. And then the connection piece, many of these are replicated because these are the ways that we can go back, we can revisit our anticipation guide to help students to connect and so on. Okay. So here's activate and assess, and it's an example. If you don't know what a anticipation guide looks like, generally what we do is come up with a series of statements that are based on the reading, prior to the reading, right? We ask our students to indicate whether they agree or disagree whether they're true or false. And then we can always return to this afterwards to help them connect to what it is they've read and understood. So for instance, the founding of American democracy, the British king had imposed unfair law and taxes without representation. American colonists were in favor of a strong central government, and so on. So we're seeing what it is that they know or don't know. We're helping them to get that mental Velcro in place. Velcro strips up, okay? When we talk about authentic artifacts, one of the things that we can do is we can use pictures, maps, music, writing, and related articles. And so here we have a description of the fact that if we're doing that coming of age unit, and many of our books have to do with, for instance, living during the Depression, then we can bring forward the photographs of Dorothea Lange. And we can model thinking about what the pictures represent and what can be inferred about the lives of the individuals in the pictures. So pictures, for instance, from migrant mothers or traveling along on Highway number 1 of the OK, the Oklahoma State near Weber's Fall. And here are the 2 pictures, for instance. And so building some background knowledge about the feelings of this mother during this time period, the feelings of individuals who are having to travel, migrant mother, migrant children in many ways, and the fact that people were suffering economically and in more ways emotionally as well. All right. Okay. So what does the informed educator do? And I believe this is in your participation guide. Again, you can ask yourself some questions as you think about, if I'm going to think about the background knowledge that's necessary, what is specific, what's necessary for them to understand the ideas in this particular text? What did the author assume my readers would bring to the text? And what are they actually bringing? And are there connections to other readings? Because oftentimes we want our students reading more than one book and different genre on a topic. How I activate, given what my students know, what else would they need to know? How I facilitate the building? How I prompt this integration of understanding? So again, I said to you that the blueprint is metacognitive. Well, yes, it poses lots of questions for us to be thinking about and to kind of push us forward in terms of how we design instruction. So we're coming close to the end here. I do just want to point out to you that I've just given you just a little snapshot, just a little sense of the activities within certain components. I've not been able, not within this time frame, to introduce you to all the components of the blueprint, but certainly through your own research, through your own reading, you're able to pursue this further. Important that we think about all of the language processes and skills as we help our students move forward. And I'm very cognizant of the fact that you need tools to make this work. And so I know that ultimately what we want to do is give teachers tools for change. So I'm hoping I gave you a few tools, all right? Certainly one of those tools is developing the specialized knowledge base and skill set, so important as we think about design and delivery. Also thinking about, this is just one way of learning, all right? And when I think about professional development, I think about the fact that it needs to address a continuum of learning opportunities. Much as our students need a continuum, so do we. So in thinking and writing about this, for instance, I think about professional communities of practice, and these have become increasingly prevalent, I think, within our schools. And certainly, one could think about a reading of any text. This one happens to be based on the text that I've currently written, but on any text about comprehension or any aspect of comprehension, and thinking about working your way through using a structured note-making guide, all right, with purpose and with setting up structure so that you can interact either through webinar, all right, or in person. And there's certainly other ways that you can develop your knowledge base. But just keeping in mind that expertise is needed. You see how complex this all is. And then, of course, planning. And I said to you up front, that blueprint was a master plan. It's not a lesson plan, or even a unit organizer. It wasn't intended to be that. It was intended to get us all thinking about, as we design unit organizers and lesson plans, what will our focus be based on the components of the blueprint. And I know good teachers, strong teachers, effective teachers always set priorities and plan instruction and allocate time and establish high expectations. This is a part of what we do, and we certainly differentiate for our students. So here's an example of a lesson organizer that's the foundation for lesson plans. The lesson plans would be more focused on specific objectives, okay? Typically include goal, subjective, sequence of lesson activities and assessment, and then plans that align with the blueprint that connect critical understandings and are typically focused on these components that I talked about. So there's a unit organizer. You see the enduring understandings, some of the essential questions. How about the content goals? All right, literacy goals, any adaptations you might need, your resources, interdisciplinary links. So thinking across discipline, what you will consider your evidence of learning, your byproducts, and then your reflections on your implementation. So this could set the tone for you. It could help you organize up if, in fact, you're planning a unit or even more than one reading, all right? And then your lesson plan, which would include the preparation for instruction and then a sequence of learning events. So again, what's your enduring understanding? What are your related essential questions? What are your objectives now? Literacy, content, resources, and then just going through what your teacher and student instructional activities would be. So for instance, you might focus on vocabulary. I mean, that might be the focus of this particular lesson plan. It might be sentence comprehension. It might be a combination of things. Again, flexibility, but keeping in mind all of those things need to be put in place. So I'm hoping you're ready to build. I know you've been building for a while, working with your students, but maybe you have some new tools, and perhaps the blueprint will help you to further your the ways in which deepen the ways in which you're addressing comprehension, elaborate on, build on, and so on. So here was today's purpose. Understand the complexity of comprehension and the role of language processes and skills. We wanted to introduce, and that's all we did. Remember the elephants there, all right? We wanted to connect to some evidence-informed instructional approaches, so you have some frameworks and a few examples. And hopefully this informed your approach to comprehension instruction. Our work is always learning. So I'm by no means done learning about comprehension. I hope you aren't either. So thank you very much for being here today. And I think we have just a few minutes for questions. I can't believe I finished that with enough time for questions.
Great. So thank you, Nancy. I do have a few questions that popped up. The first one, typically elementary curriculum is teaching using a specific comprehension skill, main idea, cause and effect for the week, and then it moves on to another skill the next week. For special education teachers that are teaching these skills in small groups, separate setting, would you teach the skill strategy along with their classroom, or would you do something different?
Okay, so you're talking about teaching an outcome, all right? So the skill, right, would allow for the students to demonstrate an outcome, and I would want to make certain that I had the language processes and skills that I've just talked about in place. Think about, what does it take to identify a main idea and details, right? What does it take to draw a conclusion? So that's one part of my response, because I'm trying to get us to a place where we recognize that it's incredibly important for students to be able to demonstrate product and understanding, to do those tasks. But I also want us thinking about, what does it take to actually do the task? When they're not able to do it, what's not in place? Is it vocabulary? Is it sentence comprehension? Is it background knowledge? What's getting in the way, all right? And I always use the text that I'm teaching from, all right, to demonstrate how to go about working with the text, to teach those strategies that ultimately do become skills for students. The focus on strategy versus skill, kind of a workbook approach versus a process approach, is a real shift. It's a different way of thinking. So I didn't exactly answer that question, but it's difficult for me to respond to that because that's not what I think will develop deep comprehension capabilities in students.
Right. Thank you. What books would you suggest to learn more about this topic?
Yeah, well, one of the books that I mentioned earlier in my inference workshop, and I'll mention here again, is Jane Oakhill, Kate Kane, and Karsten Elborough's book on understanding comprehension. I think that's an extremely good text, and it's very teacher-friendly. At some point, my text will be published, and maybe that would be helpful to you as well. But for now, take a look at Kate Kane's work and look for some of her research articles because they're really outstanding.
And Nancy, can you tell us where your book is published? What publishing company?
Yeah, Brooks Publishing will be publishing the book, and hopefully it will be published late summer, maybe early fall. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any resources on teaching comprehension by using anaphora and antecedents?
Actually, in the inference workshop that I did preceding this, I talked about local coherence inferencing and did articulate a good deal of information on cohesive devices, including cohesive ties and connectives, cohesive ties, of course, being anaphoric devices. Yeah. So maybe you want to go back and take a look at that workshop that was recorded. Yeah.
And then one last question. The preparation for instruction that you shared is not in your slides. Would you be willing to share it, or do we need to wait for your blueprint to come up?
So by the preparation for instruction, oh, you're talking about the critical understandings? I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
I'm not sure. Maybe that person, the lesson plan format, they said.
Oh, the lesson plan format. You know what? If you email me, I'll send that to you. Yeah.
Okay. And you have our email right on the slide right now.
Yeah. And I can send you a sample. I could send you a sample. Because of time, I couldn't include samples, but I have some samples from Julia Salamone, again, a very talented educator. Far be it from me, who's no longer in the classroom, to come up with samples. I asked a teacher.
Thank you. And that's all for the questions. So
Wonderful. Yeah.
we want to thank you so much, Nancy, for all your sharing with us and generosity. And to all who attended the session, it will be recorded and available at a later time on our Patent YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Our next session begins at 3:30. I did want to end by saying that Dr. Louisa Motz did ask us to share the following with all of you. For any of you who were in her breakout session today that she had, the first breakout, she said she had a transient episode. She believes a loss of blood flow and oxygen to the brain that interfered with her speech and made her a little lightheaded. However, she says once she recovered, those symptoms passed. She's feeling a lot better. She will get checked out, but she doesn't believe it's to cause any concern or worry. She appreciates so much all of your expressions of care and concern, and she hopes she will have another opportunity in the future to consider the topic she was going to address this morning. And warm best wishes to all. So thank you again for your concern, and have a wonderful ending session. It starts at 3:30. Thank you so very much.
All right. Thank you. And it's good. That's good news from Louisa.
Wonderful.
All right. Bye, everybody. Take care. Andra, are you still there?
Yes.
I don't know where this drawing on the screen came from.
I don't either. I was trying to figure out, because I don't even know how to annotate. So I didn't know. I noticed in your slides sometimes there was a little pin down at the bottom between your